The sky over Reims was a suffocating shade of gray. It was May 6, 1945, and the world was holding its breath. In a modest red brick schoolhouse that served as the Allied headquarters, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of stale coffee and heavy tobacco smoke. This wasn't a palace or a grand parliament. It was a place of war. Outside, military police stood like statues in the rain. Inside, the most powerful generals of the Allied nations, men who had spent years fighting across continents, were waiting. They weren't waiting for a battle. They were waiting for a man who represented the very evil they had sworn to destroy. A sleek black car pulled up, and out stepped Colonel General Alfred Jodl. He was the embodiment of Nazi arrogance. His uniform was immaculate. His Iron Cross hung from his neck like a trophy, and a glass monocle was fixed firmly in his eye. Jodl didn't walk like a defeated man. He marched with the stride of someone who believed he could still dictate terms. He was the chief of operations for the German High Command, the man who had authorized the Blitz on London and the slaughter of thousands on the Eastern Front. As he entered the schoolhouse, he adjusted his gloves, expecting a formal military reception. He truly believed that, as a professional soldier, he would be greeted with brandy and respect by his equal, Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. But Jodl's ego was about to be crushed. Eisenhower was sitting in a small, quiet office just down the hallway. He saw the German general arrive through the window, but he didn't move. He didn't offer a salute or a greeting. Instead, Eisenhower turned to his chief of staff and issued a cold, legendary command. I will not see him. I will not speak to him. And I will not shake his hand. Tell him he is here to sign a surrender, not to hold a conference. For the first time in his life, Jodl was treated not as a dignitary, but as a nuisance. He was left to wait in a hallway, ignored by the very men he thought would admire his military brilliance. The stage was set for his total downfall. While Jodl stood in that hallway, fuming at the lack of respect, a much larger deception was unfolding behind him. Adolf Hitler was already 6 days dead, buried beneath the rubble of Berlin, but the Nazi machine was still desperately trying to survive. Before his death, Hitler had passed the torch to Grand Admiral Doenitz, who had set up a makeshift government in Flensburg. Doenitz was not a man looking for a moral peace. He was a shark looking for a way to save the skin of the Nazi elite. He knew the war was lost, but he believed he could win the peace by playing the Western Allies against the Soviet Union. Doenitz's strategy was a dangerous gamble. He wanted to surrender to the Americans and the British in the West while continuing the slaughter against the Russians in the East. The German logic was simple. If they could delay a total surrender, they could move millions of German soldiers and high-ranking officials away from the vengeful reach of Stalin's Red Army and into the gentler custody of the Americans. Jodl had been sent to Reims with a secret mandate: talk, argue, and stall. Every hour he spent debating a comma or a phrase in the surrender document was another hour for German panzer divisions to flee west. Jodl truly believed he could charm Eisenhower or appeal to a sense of Western brotherhood against the Bolshevik threat. He didn't realize that Eisenhower was already 3 steps ahead. Before Jodl's arrival, a test envoy named Admiral Friedberg had been sent to scout the mood at the Allied headquarters. Friedberg had arrived expecting a banquet. Instead, he was shoved into a plain room where the walls were covered in massive tactical maps. These maps showed the brutal reality. The German army wasn't just losing, it was being erased. General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's hatchet man, showed Friedberg no mercy. When Friedberg tried to argue that surrendering to the Russians was uncivilized, Smith simply pointed to the map and told him that his army was a collection of ghosts. Friedberg broke down in tears, realizing the Americans weren't biting. He sent a frantic message back to Doenitz: "Send Jodl." Only a total surrender will stop the bleeding. Jodl walked into the room thinking he was a negotiator, but in reality, he was walking into a cage. Jodl was finally ushered into the war room, a converted classroom where the history of the world was being written. The space was utilitarian and cold. In the center sat a long ping-pong table draped in a simple green cloth, surrounded by hard wooden chairs. There was no fireplace, no brandy, and no comfort. Jodl scanned the room, his lip curling with disdain at the lack of ceremony. When he realized that General Eisenhower was still refusing to show his face, his Prussian pride took a massive hit. He was forced to face General Walter Bedell Smith, a man who looked at Jodl not as a military peer, but as a problem to be solved. The negotiations began, but they were quickly revealed to be a farce. Jodl laid his cards on the table with calculated precision. "We are ready to surrender to the Western Allies," he said, "but we must have 48 hours to organize our withdrawal from the East. Our soldiers cannot simply stop. They must be allowed to march into your lines to escape the Soviets." It was the same old trick, a desperate attempt to save the remnants of the Nazi war machine and create a diplomatic rift between the United States and the Soviet Union. Jodl spoke as if he were doing the Americans a favor, offering them the chance to save German soldiers from the Red Army. When Bedell Smith relayed this to Eisenhower's private office, the Supreme Commander didn't hesitate. He was done with the stalling, done with the games, and done with the Nazi ego. He issued an ultimatum so brutal it left no room for debate. Smith marched back into the war room, stood directly over Jodl, and delivered the blow. "General Eisenhower says no. There will be number 48-hour delay. There will be no separate peace." Smith then delivered the final threat that shattered Jodl's composure. "If you do not sign an unconditional surrender for both the East and the West immediately, the Supreme Commander will order the Allied lines to be sealed. We will stop accepting German refugees. We will force your retreating armies back into the hands of the Russians at gunpoint." This was the ultimate checkmate. Jodl realized that Eisenhower was willing to let the entire German retreat be slaughtered if the paper wasn't signed. The gentleman's war Jodl had imagined was a fantasy. He went pale, staring at the green cloth of the ping-pong table, realizing he had no choice left. The clock on the wall of the Reims schoolhouse ticked toward the early hours of May 7, 1945. The air in the room was heavy, stagnant with the smell of failure and the exhaustion of men who hadn't slept in days. For hours, Jodl had waited in a tense, agonizing silence for a response from Admiral Doenitz in Flensburg. The Americans and the British didn't offer him a bed or a meal. They offered him a wooden chair and the cold realization of his own irrelevance. Finally, the telegram arrived. The message was short. Doenitz authorizes signature. The last desperate hope of the Nazi government had officially collapsed. At exactly 2:41 a.m., the room was suddenly flooded with the harsh, artificial glare of movie cameras and the aggressive popping of flashbulbs. Reporters and photographers, sensing that they were about to witness the end of an era, scrambled for a view, some even standing on chairs to get a better angle. General Jodl sat at the green-covered ping-pong table, his back straight as a rod, but his face was a mask of gray stone. Next to him sat Admiral Friedberg, a man who looked like he had already been hollowed out by the weight of the moment. Across from them sat the Allied representatives, led by Bedell Smith, who watched the Germans with a look of pure, clinical detachment. The document was pushed across the table. It was titled Act of Military Surrender. It was a short, blunt instrument of justice, less than 300 words that signaled the end of 60 million lives and a decade of global terror. Jodl reached into his pocket, pulled out his fountain pen, and with a hand that betrayed a slight, rhythmic tremor, he signed his name. One by one, The Allied generals followed. In just a few minutes, the greatest machinery of death in human history was legally dismantled by a few drops of ink. After Jodl laid the pen down, he stood up. He adjusted his tunic, cleared his throat, and delivered a final, desperate plea for sympathy. He spoke about the suffering of the German people and the bravery of his soldiers, asking the victors for mercy. He spoke as if the atrocities of the Holocaust, the leveling of cities, and the mass executions never happened. When he finished, he waited for a response, a nod, a word of military respect, or even a glance of understanding. But he received nothing. The room remained as silent as a grave. The Allied officers simply stared at him with cold, hard eyes, refusing to grant him even the dignity of an argument. Jodl snapped a hollow salute and walked out, unaware that his final humiliation was yet to come. As Jodl stepped out of the war room, he believed the dirty work was finished. He adjusted his iron cross and regained his arrogant posture, assuming that now that the paperwork was signed, the professional military etiquette would resume. He expected to finally be invited into Eisenhower's inner sanctum, not as a prisoner, but as a high-ranking officer to be treated with the honor he felt he deserved. A guard intercepted him and delivered the news. "General Eisenhower will see you now." Jodl straightened his tunic and marched toward the Supreme Commander's office, preparing himself for a soldier-to-soldier salute. He entered the office to find Dwight D. Eisenhower standing like a wall behind his desk. The atmosphere was freezing. Eisenhower did not offer a chair, he did not offer a drink, and most importantly, he did not offer his hand. In the world of the European military elite, a handshake was the ultimate sign of mutual respect and honor. By keeping his hands firmly behind his back, Eisenhower sent a message that cut deeper than any court sentence. "You are not an honorable enemy. You are a criminal." Eisenhower's voice was like ice as he asked two short questions. "Do you understand the terms? Do you understand they must be obeyed?" Jodl could only manage a whispered "Jawol." Without another word, Eisenhower signaled the guards to take him away. The meeting lasted less than a minute. Jodl was dismissed like a servant, his pride utterly extinguished. The end for the men in that room was swift. Admiral Friedberg, unable to face the reality of a world without Nazi power, committed suicide just weeks later. General Jodl, who thought he had successfully negotiated his way into a peaceful retirement, was instead arrested and transported to Nuremberg. There, he was tried for the very orders he had signed with such arrogance. In 1946, the man who had marched into the Reims schoolhouse with a monocle and a crisp uniform was executed by hanging. He died at the end of a rope, a loser in both war and morality. Eisenhower, the man who refused to shake a Nazi's hand, went on to become the President of the United States and a symbol of the free world. His refusal to treat Jodl as an equal set the moral tone for the entire post-war era. It sent a clear message to history, that some crimes are so great they forfeit the right to professional courtesy. By turning his back on Jodl, Eisenhower kept the hands of the Allied nations clean. It was the ultimate insult to the master race, and the ultimate victory for humanity. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you think. If you were in Eisenhower's place, would you have shaken his hand? Or refused? Let me know in the comments. And subscribe for more.